Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only No BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Joining me today to share the 10 books that had a major impact on her life and her work is visionary teacher and shamanic guide Linda Starwolf, Ph.D., the founder and co-director of Venus Rising Association for Transformation, and founder and president of Venus Rising University for Shamanic Psychospiritual Studies. She's the creator of the Shamanic Breathwork Process, as well as the Shamanic Ministers Global Network and the Wise Wolf Council. A spiritual granddaughter of Seneca Wolf Clan grandmother Twylah Nitsch. I'm sorry. Hang on, I'm going to cut that piece out. A spiritual granddaughter of Seneca Wolf Clan grandmother Twylah Nitsch, Starwolf is the author of several books, including The Aquarian Shaman, Walking the Spiral Path to Transformation, Shamanic Breathwork, Journeying Beyond the Limits of the Self, and she's co-author of Visionary Shamanism, Shamanic Egyptian Astrology, Shamanic Mysteries of Egypt, and the Anubis Oracle, all of which sound very intriguing. Starwolf, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you again, Sandy.
You too. So tell me about how you found the process of having to cull your list of most influential books down to just 10.
I'll have to say it was difficult. It was a fun, difficult task, but it was such an incredible journey down memory lane. As I said, I'll be 73 this year, and my father was a big reader, so he started me reading when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I've always been a big reader and always have 5 or 6 books going at the same time, to move around with. But going back through that, I felt I'm surrounded by my books here in my little medicine room, in my office. I felt them all jumping off the shelf saying, pick me, pick me. But so it really made me do a deep investigation, like, what do I remember reading and still have on my shelves and still even go back to in my teachings or in, my spiritual path. And so it was a beautiful, lovely journey of a couple of days. And then one evening of just forcing myself to sit down and with my books around me, just kind of putting my hand on them and blessing those teachers, thanking them, knowing that most of them have passed on, actually. And some are, they're all older than me. And so there's many wonderful, of course, new authors in the last,
Yes.
2-3 decades. But those were the ones that transformed my life and set me on my path. And many have inspired me since then. But I had to be true to what had affected me most when I was most seeking.
Yes, and that's the whole point of the book club. It is really to provide, trusted recommendations for those that are waking up and saying, well, where do I start? Yeah. So people say to me, oh, yeah, I loved Celestine Prophecy, but, I'm way past that now, so I won't include that. But no, if that was something that really gave you a breakthrough, it should be included.
Yes, that's very true. I had, I truly had a list of about 50 books. And so then I narrowed it down and narrowed it down and narrowed it down. And, I felt like, okay, I hope you'll do this again. And I'll get another round to bring those in, because I'm a very big believer of reading other people's journeys
Yes.
and what wisdom they've acquired. it's, in the olden days, in ancient times, you didn't have that. What you had was direct transmissions from the teachers to the people that would, like with Plato or whatever, that would sit in a circle around them, and they would be, in their own mystery school. And I've, in my own work, try to replicate that with groups, mystery school groups that I work with, as I take a small number of people and I disseminate that to them. And I suggest the books that I would suggest they read. And then also I work with them and their questions, and then just what I've learned on my path. So for me, the book is really sacred. And I just want to say one other thing before we move on. And that is, as I said, I believe I may have said it already, but I'll say again, is that my father was a big reader. And he was just a man from Western Kentucky, veteran, and a police officer, and beautiful soul, beautiful spiritual man. And he was always reading, always had a couple of books reading. And I would sit on the couch and he'd sit on the chair, and we'd be reading on the days when mom was working, and he worked different shifts, and he'd be at home with me when I was little. And starting out with Peter Rabbit, he'd read to me or something and give me books to read. So I really give my father credit. And he used to say to me, as long as you read, you will grow. And I wasn't sure what he meant by that. But he said, you'll learn things, but not just in school. Read when you're at home. You will continue to learn more about yourself and the world, whether it's fact or fiction, the books. Yeah. And so we usually both had a couple of books going. And we'd say on Saturday afternoons, Mama might be working, we'd be sitting there and reading our books together. He passed in 2020 in my arms, out of my mom's arms, and he was 94. Wow. And he still, even with his Alzheimer's that he had and couldn't really read, he would still pick his books up and hold them in his hands. And I would see him, I knew he was struggling, he couldn't read, so I'd read to him, but he would still like to hold his books.
Yeah. I can't imagine a world without books.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at your first book on your list. It is the Bible, King James Version. And you said that this was really important to you as far back as you can remember and into your early adult life.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were Christian. My grandparents were Christians. I would say that they were Jimmy Carter Christians. They believe that, by your works shall you know them. They helped their neighbors. They gave their stuff out of the garden to the other neighbors who might not have food. My grandfather, one was a carpenter, the other was a coal miner. And so they were, on the ground earth people, but they were deeply spiritual. My Mammy Jones, who is still to this day my most influential teacher, spiritual teacher, she was always reading too. And she loved to read glamour magazines. So we would go when I was a little girl, we would go to the grocery store, and they would have a rack with comic books. And you'd turn them around, and I think they were maybe 20 cents or something, maybe a dime. I don't remember back then. But she would always pick up a Vanity Fair or Look or the one, or True Confessions or something, which I would sneak and read sometimes down in the chicken yard. But anyway, she would always tell me, now you've been really good. You've helped me this week. You can pick yourself out 2 comic books. And I would take those Archie and Veronica comic book or Mighty Mouse or whatever, and I would read them over and over and over again. So it was important in my family all the way around for, we were not highly intellectual. My other grandmother and grandfather had 5 boys. My dad was the oldest. And like I said, my grandpa was a carpenter. My grandmother was a piano teacher. But they supported their sons. And interestingly enough, my dad was the oldest. He's the only one that didn't go to college. And that's kind of a feat that they managed to help the rest go through. But my dad went to the war instead, and then he came back and married my mom, and then they created a life, and he became a police officer, and radio dispatcher. But I think about my grandmother was reading music. She loved music and was always reading, that grandmother, about music reviews. And she actually even played at the Grand Ole Opry, which was a couple hours away from where they lived, and for the silent movies.
Mm.
And so I'm just thinking about all the ways in which we read, reading music, reading for fun, reading comics, all these things that if we're taking the time to give our attention and look with our eyes and feel with our emotions and hearts, books have, and reading has profound effect on who it is we become.
It does, and it's interesting you say all the different ways that we read, and for fun, for various reasons. What did you read the Bible for?
Well, first of all, we were going to church, and you hear the minister, and this one church we went to for a while, which we actually ended up leaving, but was kind of a hellfire and brimstone preacher, and if you don't do this, blah blah blah. So um, and you need to be reading your Bible and that sort of things. Unfortunately, he was focusing on reading the Old Testament versus the New Testament, which is quite different. But
Mm.
anyway, I would read the Old Testament as a little kid and not really understanding much of it because of these and the thous and the generations and that sort of thing. But when I read read the New Testament, my heart opened up more and I had experiences there. And then my mammy, Jones, bought me this book called Bible Stories for Children. And they tone it down, and it's softer, and it mainly spoke about, like I would call the Jimmy Carter Jesus, about love and good works and caring about your neighbors and being kind and those kinds of things. And so the Bible for me became, you know, as it was for my whole family, a holy book that taught about love and forgiveness, and that Jesus came, and there was a whole thing of dying for your sins. I never really liked that part. I always felt, even as a little kid, I thought, if I'm guilty, I'm guilty. It's okay, Jesus, you don't have to do this for me, you know? But I didn't focus on that much, and none of my family did. What we mainly focused on was being good people, being good to your neighbors, and following Jesus's path of peace. As I got older and became a hippie, and I was a little more cocky about things and reading what I would call more intellectual discourses and politics and different theologies, and discovering other forms of spirituality. Then I kind of did that thing that you do. It's like my parents don't know anything, and the Bible doesn't either, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But
Mm.
in time, I came back around through, and we'll talk about this more with some of the other books. Everything else that I read really was saying the best parts of the Bible. And I came out of my rebellion stage, which I think is a good stage actually, to be able to see the good that was there and
Yeah,
to be able to face the reality of who it was written by, when it was written, and thousands of years it was put together. But you really begin to know the facts about things, and that it's a spiritual book. It's obviously affected incredibly people all around the world. It's been a best-selling book forever and all of that. So there's something there.
yeah.
There's something there, and to see what it means to you. And for me, it seems the passages there that I'm most touched by. I love the Psalms, but I especially love the teachings of Christ. And yeah, I'd say that's a foundation in my life of
Yeah.
love and forgiveness.
And you said that book number two, A Course in Miracles by Helen Schucman, published in 1976. Of course, that truly did have some of the best bits of the Bible.
Absolutely.
Mm.
What's Can I say something about the Course in Miracles now?
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Um, It's interesting because just last evening or evening before last, I did an online breath work for 3 hours with about 50 people. And in that, I mentioned the Course in Miracles. And it was interesting for me just to feel into that, and and I had people on from all around, the country and the world and that sort of thing. And I'm just aware that different people were talking when they were processing they were talking about different books that had impressed them. So I had mentioned this, that I had just had to do this and that sort of thing. And with the most interesting thing came up. One of the women who processed her journey with the group after they were doing processing. And she said, one of the things that happened for me is that somebody gave me this stapled pieces of paper, and it was the Course in Miracles before it was actually a book. And this happened in, I don't know, the 1980s or something. I can't remember exactly, but it was a long time ago. And I had to laugh. I said, that happened to me too. I was a young woman, and I had now come out of the college stage, and I was now facing that I had some addictions, and I came into recovery. And at that very time, somebody in AA handed me these papers that were stapled together, had been just typed out on a typewriter and Xeroxed. And it was called A Course in Miracles. It had not become a book yet. It was being put together. I don't know. I can't remember the person that gave it to me. It's how long ago it was. And I lived in Florida at the time. I haven't lived there in 40 years, 35 years. But I went and started reading all of this, and there was this whole way in which, as I was really seeking to define my own higher power at that time with the recovery, that this worked so beautiful that I didn't have to just kind of really discard my old path or completely take a completely radically new one, but I could see it in a different light. And it was so beautiful, especially about it all being about forgiveness. Yeah. And my father had always said to me, Jesus' main teaching was about love and forgiveness.
Yeah.
So that was a real gift. And, it feels like little miracles. It feels like little or big ones sometimes. It feels when something like that happens and you're needing to define what your higher power is now, and somebody hands you this book that isn't a book yet, that goes on to be this huge selling book in the world. It really feels almost like a spirit guide or something just handed it to you. Yeah. Of course, later on, the book came out and I bought it, but it never quite held the same energy for me as that stapled together papers that typed out.
And the timing of that, incredible. So the next book number 3, is a book that rocked your world, changed your perception of reality, and gave you the courage to explore LSD firsthand and begin a meditation practice. And that was Be Here Now by Ram Dass, published in 1971.
Whew. Oh my God. That was the year that I went to University of Kentucky. That's the year that I moved into a little commune with a group of people. The person left that had the house, so I took it over in my own name. I was like 19 or 20. No, I'm 19 years old. I took the lease on. A whole bunch of people moved in with me. We had dogs and goats, and it was a bizarre time. And I'm sitting up in my loft where I slept at night, and studying to be a social worker and reading Ram Dass, and my mind is just being blown. And we're going out in the streets and the campus, and we're marching against the war in Vietnam. There's all this going on. Kent State happens, where students are actually massacred for different things that were happening there around the war. It was such a time of challenge with the assassinations that had happened in the government and that kind of thing. And here I'm reading about peace. Again, another being talking about peace. And Ram Dass, Baba Ram Dass, had this, much like Krishna, he'd had this opulent life, and he walked away from it, and he went to India and he found his guru, and it took him a while to do all that. But he dedicated the rest of his life to peace, love, and forgiveness, and pray and serve until even after he had a stroke and could barely talk and was in a wheelchair, he continued to the very end to love, remember, and to remember to love and to serve. And I lived out in California for a while, many, many years later. And I also I worked at a breathwork group, and we brought in all these different people. And one of the people that came in was Ram Dass. So I got to meet him several times. I got to kiss him on the cheek and hold his hand and talk with him, and before he had his stroke. And then I saw him, the last time I saw him, I was having lunch at a restaurant in Marin County, and he was too, in his wheelchair. And I went over and gave him a big hug and just said, I know you know this, and a million people have told you, but you radically changed my life. And when I hugged him, he said, "Oh, you just changed mine." He was so humble and sweet. But again, another Christ-like figure, although he wouldn't want to be called that with his humility, but really speaking about time to blow our minds, blow out the old.
Yeah.
And of course, he was experimenting with psychedelics. He'd been a psychologist and working with it when LSD when it first came out. But that gave me a desire to know more about myself, whatever that meant. And of course, I've always been like that. But, reading that, it did make me want to do it, made a lot of us want to try it. Excuse me. And so trying the LSD, I should say several times, and other forms of psychedelics, I really stepped, quote, into my hippiedom, off went the bra, feathers went in the hair, the jeans with the patches, all this whole kind of stereotype, but it was true. Peace, love, and Woodstock, and all of the rock festivals where people were teaching about peace. And I'm watching a whole culture that wasn't there before develop. And I'm right in the middle of it, And this little girl from Madisonville, Kentucky didn't quite know what to think. But I ended up being kind of like one of the people known in Lexington for my hippie household where you could come and do LSD, and all these sort of things. And then we would sit with people if they were having a hard time or taking them through. And I thought this was early training for my shamanic breathwork journeys.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And of course, I watched some people really not do well with those psychedelics. And I had an experience at the end that made me stop that was really life-threatening. Excuse me. So, with all of that awareness and awakening, there's always the shadow that comes with it.
Always.
And that was what I had to face in myself and in that medicine for me. So nowadays, when not everybody, when lots of people are doing psychedelics, I have no desire to do them. We use the breath instead. And I go wherever I've gone before, I go there just as easily with the breath work. And the landing when I come home is much gentler.
Yeah, for sure. Well, book number 4, you describe as a little book that took you on a big journey to your higher self and opened your heart. This book comes up many, many, many times in the book club's choices. Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Clark, published in 1970.
I love that little booklet. And I remember reading it and just sobbing, through the whole thing. And just this, and again, it was by Richard Bach. It was, and he wrote some other beautiful books too. And I wanted to name them, but it was like, I just have to really be selective here. But I appreciated the simplicity of it. I appreciated that anyone, just about anybody, almost of any age, as long as they could read, it could reach people through all kinds of intellectual statuses, and open the heart. Very, about the holy longing that's inside of every one of us. We are all Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Every one of us has a longing to fly in our own way. We want to be more than just eating and sleeping and going to work or doing this or that or whatever. We all feel like, isn't there more? Isn't there something else? And I absolutely believe that. And it's what I teach all the time in my training programs and healing programs, is that we all have a sacred purpose. And that part of the sacred purpose is born out of our challenges. And of course, that's what Jonathan is teaching throughout the whole thing, is that he doesn't just arrive at the place where he's enlightened or aware or conscious. It's a journey, and it's a spiral journey. And there's lots of ups and downs and some feeling like there's failures. But, his heart and his willingness to fail and his willingness to get back up and to keep going and to confront his own monkey mind that would want to stop him, or if even other people made fun of him, other seagulls made fun of him and those kind of things, he learned to be true to himself. So all those adversities that we don't like, that, or I don't like, are the very deep, what I call shamanic initiations happening along the way to enlightenment and awareness and awakening. And so when we get, we don't know that on the way. We just feel like we're messing up, we're never going to get there, and all those kinds of things. But if we can just keep coming back to our hearts and our truth and remembering what the sacred is inside of us. And I remember one of my teachers said to me, God, Great Spirit, Great Mystery, would not call you to do this thing if you were not meant to do it. And sometimes consciousness and love and awareness just takes a little longer than we thought it would. And so I think that book did a great service for all kinds of people all around the world to remind them to be true to their path.
Yeah. Well, we've done probably about 275 of these interviews, and people with their 10 best lists. And this consistently comes up in the top 10 of all times recommendations. Yeah.
That's sweet, that little booklet coming up like that. I love it. The little seagull.
Yeah. So book number 5 is Soul Retrieval, Mending the Fragmented Self by Sandra Ingerman, published in 1991. And I know that you studied her work deeply to recover your own soul parts.
Definitely. And at that time, I had not met Sandra or talked to her in person, but I was gobbling it up. Again, at this point, I was in my own sobriety. I was a counselor at the mental health center. I was getting my addictions license and my social work license, like these kinds of things. So I was well on my path personally and professionally. And after reading, some of the other books and things that I had read, somehow or another, I got led to all of a sudden shamanism. I think now that I think back on it, what happened is quite a few people, quite frankly, that were in AA and Al-Anon down in Spring Hill, Florida, were also deeply mystical. I find that's true with many people in recovery. And they were already mystics, and then they got sober, and then they realized they were mystics, and that's why they weren't fitting into regular society. And there was I cannot remember the name of it right now, but not just maybe a couple hours from where I live in Spring Hill, Florida, there was a retreat center down there all those years ago. And a lot of the AA people would go down there because they said this is the really spiritual programs happen here. And they're not necessarily 12-step programs, but other programs. And I was already going to Unity Church there and all these kinds of things. But I went down and they had some native people there. And the native people were passing the pipe around for everybody to share the pipe. They did a pipe ceremony. They were doing drumming ceremonies. I had never experienced that before. And something inside of me just jumped alive, just really came into this alive place. And there was a way in which I just felt that there was something waking up inside of me, not only from my recovery, but something deep down that I was remembering, something ancient. And also I started thinking about my childhood and growing up with my Mammy Jones. And even though she wasn't Native American, she was, Scotch Irish and came from that kind of very similar to Native American energy with the old ways. And so it's like I got her back. She passed long, long ago when I was 12. But all of a sudden, these things made me think of her and my childhood and how closely I felt to the earth. Because with more like Course in Miracles and some of these other things were kind of more like up and out, which was really beautiful and expansive. But in my sobriety, it was like I felt like I needed also more down and in and touching the earth. Mm-hmm. And so with the soul retrieval, I realized with my sobriety, that's exactly what I had done. I'd had a soul retrieval. I was getting back parts of myself. And so I really was looking at the language of that. And as I would read about this, I thought, I'd really love to go and have some soul retrieval experiences. And of course, if you're longing for something, it's going to come to you. It wasn't too long after that I had connection when I was back into Kentucky and we moved back with a dear friend named Teresa, who's Cherokee. And she talked to me about doing what she didn't call it soul retrieval, but she called it remembering, integrating and bringing back the memories, the healing of the memories. So she did this journey with me. And I gave her the book on that same book. And she said, "Oh, this is what we do. This is, that sort of thing." It was through Sandra's book of finding the soul retrieval that really pulled me fully into what they called the native path back then more. Now we call it more shamanic, but that wasn't a super popular word. But that's what led me to Grandmother Twylah Nitsch, my main Wolf Clan teacher, who brought me fully into these teachings and initiated me over the years. But it all started with Sandra's book. Mm-hmm. And Sandra and I have been developing a friendship more recently and have had some conversations and talked on the phone with one another. And I really feel that she's such an amazing wisdom keeper. Yes. I honor her so tremendously. And it feels like that we're developing a deep soul friendship with one another. And I've shared with her some of my gratitude, and yeah, so it's been very, very sweet to speak with her recently, just a couple of weeks ago.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview and sharing the 10 books that had the biggest influence on her life and philosophies. Today is visionary teacher and shamanic guide, author and creator of the Shamanic Breathwork Process, Star Wolf. We'll be back with more from Star Wolf after this break.
Welcome to Om Times TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting Om Times Media's flagship radio show What Is Going On and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit sedgbeer.com, click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's sedgbeer.com, sedgbeer.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those 3 levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
So we're going to have to speed it up a little bit, because what I want, we've got 5 more books to get
Okay,
through.
great.
And I want to leave some space so that we can talk a little bit about what you're doing and what you've got going and what you're offering. Okay, so welcome back. Star Wolf, book number 6, Alcoholics Anonymous, by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, also known as The Big Book, published in 1939.
Thank God, Goddess, for all there is. Thank it especially for the 12 steps of recovery. I still work those 12 steps. I don't work them, I live them. And like I said, it'll be March 21st this year will be, one day at a time, will be 43 years that I've walked this path. And it's, the 12 steps and the Big Book are really, I guess you could say, my more modern day, 10 Commandments and Bible. And some people say, well, isn't it outdated? It's a lot of old stories and this, that, and I'm like, those stories from those other people are your elders. And that's how people have always learned. And it might not be some of the same things you would think of now that's happening now, but the issues are always the same. Marriages, children, jobs, mental health, those kinds of things. The Big Book, of course, directed me towards a path, of working the 12 steps of recovery. And those 12 steps are all spiritual in nature. They ask you to, admit where you're having trouble, where you have felt powerless and your life is unmanageable. And that's humiliating sometimes to say, I'm powerless, especially over alcohol or donuts or, cigarettes or relationships or anything. So to give you a concrete, if you will, a solid foundation to systematically work through the 12 steps, starting with, that your life is unmanageable because of certain behaviors that you just can't quit because it's got this obsessive compulsive addiction going on. It's humbling, it's embarrassing, and eventually it's freeing, because the truth does set us free. And so that those 12 steps in that book talk of people's stories and tell what those steps are in more depth. And there's other books that explain it even more. But after all these years, I still refer people to it who are having trouble with any addiction, whatever it might be, and say, just read this with open mind, open heart, and with humility. And know that for as long as there's been people, there's been addictions. We all seek to escape pain or uncomfortability. It's not because we're bad. It's because we're human. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when we escape too much into Netflix, talking to myself this winter, whatever it might be, when we escape too much, at some point we have to say enough. And if we can't, then we've lapsed over into addiction. And that's where this comes in. It's not for somebody who's just doing something and who can then stop, but for you find yourself compulsively, obsessively repeating certain patterns. So I think that it's still an inspiration. I don't think that some people say it's archaic. I'm like, well, a lot of people are going out looking for ancient text.
The Bible.
That's right. So I would still say to people, lighten up, open your mind and your heart, and just read it and appreciate those people who went before you dealing with their addictions and sharing their stories to hopefully someday help you.
Yeah. Book number 7, The Way of the Shaman, by Michael Harner, published in 1990. And of course, we all know he was the founder of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies.
Yeah, I never did get to meet Michael, but I've worked with and talked with quite a few people that knew him closely, that worked with him and that, had soul retrieval work with him and all that sort of thing. And of course, he and Sandra were very connected and working together. So I really found that around the same time that I found, was working with Sandra's work, and his work was kind of together at the same time. But I actually just ordered that book again because I couldn't find it. And I was afraid it would disappear, like all of a sudden not be available anymore. So I went ahead and ordered it, and I got 2 copies. So I just got them the other day, and it brought back all these memories for me of reading it. And again, I felt like a kid in a candy shop. It was, as I was reading that book, it was like My gosh, of course, all of what happens to us from the minute we're born, there's parts of us in order to be accepted by our families, by school, by religious institutions, whatever, that starts tucking away parts of ourselves that we willingly let go of or repress in order to be loved and casted into the shadows. And then in addition to that, there's horrible things that happen to people, whether it's incest or sexual abuse or injuries, physical injuries, sicknesses, loved ones dying early on, like what happened for me, those kinds of things. And it's just too much sometimes for the human psyche. We don't have the capabilities, do we, to really be able to digest that information, to process it. And it creates, these other reactions and sometimes illnesses with us and addictions and things. So retrieval work that Michael taught, and from his books, The Way of the Shaman, we learned that we could get those parts back, that we could do the work, do the inner work, and have soul retrievals. And there's many ways to have soul retrievals. You can have it officially in the ways that he taught and that he studied with different native peoples around the world. He really was a brilliant man. Even though I didn't meet him, I understood he was a brilliant mind. He had many different degrees. He went out into the world. He worked with shamans. He experienced firsthand healing for himself and for others. And he brought it back to, quote, the modern world. And out of everybody, I credit him more than anyone of making shamanism available to everyday people. And then right there next to him, Sandra, because the two of them really dedicated their lives to it. When I was talking to Sandra the other day, and I said, I've been doing shamanic work consciously, for over 3 decades, close to 4 decades. And she said, me too, and a little bit longer. And and I said, I feel a little ancient with that, I said, but I'm so grateful because now I'm watching all these people popping up wanting to do shamanic work. And I still say, go back to Michael Harner's book, go to Sandra's book. Oh, and if you want to learn the techniques and things that I do and ceremonies, here's a list of my books as well. So I have to kind of put them together, their books at the same time within a year of one another. And that I really want to acknowledge not only their books, but acknowledge them as the male and female leader of that movement in the modern, postmodern world. And that the reason that so many people knew about it, to have this explosion of interest at this time.
Yeah. So book number 8, Creature Teachers, A Guide to Spirit Animals of the Native American Tradition by grandmother Twylah Nitsch, published in 1997.
Well, Graham, she wrote things in the back of pieces of paper and all over the place, notebooks and things like this for years. And she really didn't set out to write any books. She just would write things down on snippets of paper. I was staying up in her loft one night sleeping, and she said, pull that stuff out of that loft, if you will, out of the attic, and let's see if there's anything in there that's... And I pulled out this humongous box with just pages, like of a notebooks or scraps of paper, things she had written. And so I started trying to kind of compile some of it, and put it together and staple it or see if it related to this or that and that sort of thing. She'd just write down things in an altered state or that she was inspired and then just shove it in the box. But anyway, her oral teachings that she gave, for instance, to Jamie Sams, who wrote the medicine cards and things like that. She did many oral teachings to people that then became teachings out in the world. And she had many, many students and many people that loved her of all nationalities and all races. And so there's many people all around the world who hopefully, like I do, acknowledge Grandmother Twylah. We could say that Grandmother Twylah has written most of her books through us. Okay. But she also had these, I don't have it right here right now, but she also would make these little booklets and type it out and then staple them, and I've got several of those of hers, and that inspired me. But the creature teachers, which I so love, and that somebody helped her get that together and get that published. The creature teachers, Graham, it was her favorite thing was animals. She was such a huge animal lover. And she said her grandfather, Moses Shango Hurd, when she was a little girl, She passed when she was 94, actually. But her grandfather, I don't know how old he was, but that Moses Shango heard was a tremendous well-known healer in his village and their tribe. And that he was teaching her from a very little girl, that she didn't even realize it, all these teachings about the animals and everything that she grew up to teach her children, to teach her family and friends, other people who are interested, and then opening up during that era of the 60s and 70s and 80s to other people who were non-native, such as myself, that would come to her. And then certain people like myself that just latched onto her, she was like a fountain for me at that time, that she really transmitted those things too. But the creature teachers was the first thing she ever directly taught me. I was on her at her place in the reservation, staying with her, and she started showing me the animals and helped me look at these different animals and which ones were most related to me, my 9 power animals, and whether it was one in the east and the south and the west and the north and the within and the above and below. Anyway, and that all of these walked with you like a wolf pack. They all walked, flew, crawled with you. And that each one of them was an aspect of your personality. And to this day, I still walk strongly with all of those energies, but especially, of course, with the wolf. She was mainly wolf tribe, and she had stones that you would turn over, and it had the name of the creature or the image of it on the other side that she had made. And the first one that I pulled was the wolf. And she said, I knew you were a wolf. And so that became my main path. So, being able to connect with the personalities or the characteristics of certain creatures and seeing how you can develop those abilities is really a part of the medicine of the creature teachers. And it's also fun for children. I have grandchildren and they look, Mammy Wolf, we want to pull a card. And then my one grandson pulled the eagle and another grandson goes, darn, I love that one. So it's great for kids too.
So book number 9, Transformers, Therapists of the Future, and 11 more books by Jacqueline Small, published in 1990. So we've got about 10 minutes, so we're going to have to zip through this one pretty quickly.
Jacqueline Small is still alive, and she's my teacher. She'll always be my teacher. For me, Jacqueline Small and Grandmother Twylah are my 2 main teachers, and Jacqueline is the greatest mystic I've ever known. She's such a phenomenal mystic. The book Transformers, she says, what a channeled book that she wrote. And she's written, as you know, I think 11 or 12 books. I can't remember at this moment. She even wrote a book a couple of years ago about the Gnostic Christ. She's amazing. But the Transformers book really speaks about that we are the therapist or the counselors, and I would say shamans of the future. I would say it would, for me, the Transformers was the precursor to my book, Aquarian Shaman, really. Because in Aquarian Shaman, I'm seeing that we all have this shamanic consciousness. We're in the age of Aquarius. We're all here to be teachers of some kind. And that's exactly what she was saying, that everybody has that, but especially those who are called to the field of counseling or ministering to others, that we're here to help people not reform, but to transform. Reform goes back to be the same old. Transforms as we become a whole new being. So Transformers really was the first book that inspired me to fully integrate psychology and shamanism, because I understood that the transformation that she was talking about was nothing less than an ego death and rebirth. And that's what I've been doing my whole life. So read Jacqueline's stuff. It's amazing. It's still, for me, the absolute best. And because she was a social worker and a therapist and a licensed clinical social worker and therapist, she's really good for people who work in that field and want to bridge the shamanic world, the transformational world, with psychology.
I should look that one up.
Yeah, you'll love it. I fell in love with her.
Meet in the Shadow by Jungian master teacher Jeremiah Abrams, published in 1991. You call this book a masterpiece.
It is a masterpiece. And I would just say this. I met Jeremiah. He actually came to Psyche Institute, which is Jacqueline's institute, Jacqueline Smalls. He came there to be our master teacher, to teach us about the shadow, so that while we were doing integrative and holotropic breath work, that when the shadows would come up, that we would be able to know how to help people integrate their disowned parts and to keep them from going into psychosis, basically, because that's what happens is sometimes you become enlightened too soon. So it was about how to take people through the arduous task of facing the unwanted parts of themselves. So it's a lot like inner child work, but it's also looking at places where unconsciously you have acted out in different ways, and that you need to take responsibility for those actions, not only to make amends to other people and correct things in your life, but for yourself, because you carry that with you, whether you're conscious of it or not. And of course, that whole thing about the shadow is it's unconscious. Jeremiah just passed a couple of years ago, and I loved him deeply. We were together as love partners and colleagues for close to 7 years. We taught at Esalen Institute. We taught in Greece. We taught the shadow and the inner child all around the world. And we brought breath work into it, which really opened people up to their shadow. And what I will say about shadow work is that shadow work, people go, no, I just want to be in the light. And I'm like, whoops, you need to do shadow work. So do I, but you do too, because the light and the shadow are like this. They're intertwined, and the light is born from the darkness. Remember, even in all creation stories, we start out in the darkness, and then the creator or the great goddess, whatever you want to call it, says, let there be light. And the light comes in. So that's the light that penetrates into the darkness. But I think that, in the deep space, we pretty much know that it is the void that holds us, and the light is born from it. And the shadow work is the precursor, I believe, truly, to knowing ourselves and owning it, and to having the awakenings that we want to have, and to have more light and more happiness and more joy. But we can't do that through denial and through addictions. So the light needs to come in, and it can't come without owning our shadow. And and more than anybody that I know of, and I have all the shadow books from everybody that I admire and love and respect. And Jeremiah was many of their teachers, and he certainly taught me what I know about the shadow, and came to Psyche Institute with Jacqueline and taught it to our group. So forever grateful to him for many reasons in my life, and feel him as a spirit guide and helper. And he loved grandmother Twylah. I introduced the two of them, and they fell in love with each other. And so that was a great thing to be able to introduce the two of them together.
Well, that's your 10 best list. We don't have a lot of time to talk about you, but one question I would like to ask you, and if people have lots of other questions, they can go and watch our other interview that we did on What is Going On a couple of months ago, where there's lots of things that you answer there. But the particular question I want to ask you now is, you're a spiritual granddaughter. What does that actually mean to you?
Yeah. Well, there's two things. My grandmothers have all been gone for a long time, but especially the one that I was so close to when I was 12. And I felt like that I was looking unconsciously for that grandmother, Mammy Jones, my whole life. And that, there was a part of me that had been this really kind of innocent girl. And I kind of went into kind of a wild child out of so much pain in my adolescence, hence my addictions and various things. And so I was, I didn't know I was looking for my grandmother, but that's what I was looking for, that kind of love. And I had already done a lot of healing in my own recovery and studies and, intellectual pursuits and experiences. But when I met grandmother Twylah, I'm going to get teary. I got my grandmother back, and she recognized me immediately. She called me by a name that I did not tell her, but she had given it to me in a dream vision, and I already had it. That was Starwolf. She had no way of knowing that, and she called me that name to my face, and I wilted to the ground. And I remembered the magic of my biological grandmother, maternal grandmother, and how she made my life magical as a child. And grandmother Twylah brought all that back to me, and she helped me remember why I wanted to be a social worker and a therapist and a counselor and all those things to begin with, and how there was more than that. That's wonderful, but there was so much more. She taught me to be a teacher. She taught me to be a leader. she taught me to walk with the wolf, which is the clan of the teachers. And she said, "You are my granddaughter." And I just spoke about this in a recording the other day. I'll close with this, that on the day she passed, I had no idea that she was passing that day, that I was at a retreat. And when I came back from the woods where I went early that morning to meditate and pray, I came back and on my phone, it said, call the number. And I called back and it was her daughter-in-law calling to tell me that Graham had passed and that she'd asked for me. And I said, well, she found me because she got me up at 4 a.m. and I never get up that early. And I went out to the 2 grandmother trees on the property there. And she gave me a vision that day. And that afternoon, we played breathwork music. She wouldn't let anything play. It just wouldn't play, no matter what we tried to play, until I put on her favorite tape. It was a tape at the time. And it was called The Spirit, and it was spirit music, and it for Native Americans. And that was the only tape that would play. And so we did our breath work in honor that day. And everybody that day that did the breath work, shamanic breath work, afterwards when they shared, had a personal visitation from grandmother Twylah. It's a powerful soul. She was 5 foot tall and full of Sagittarian passion. I'm a Sag too. So I really feel, and my grandmother that passed was a Sagittarian. So I really know that she and my grandmother on the other side cheering me on, and their birthdays in real time are the same year, 2 days apart. And you can't make that up.
No, you can't. Star Wolf, I've got so many more questions. I want to ask you a lot about Shamanic Egypt, but we're going to have to save that. I think you're going to have to come back on what is going on, and we'll have deeper conversations on your other books, but we're out of time now. So thank you for adding your 10 best list of spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. We really appreciate your contribution.
Thank you. And thank you for a really relaxed and comfortable interview. I love sharing this in such a way. And I feel like I'm just talking to you, but I'm glad that hopefully this will go out to lots of people and perhaps inspire them to see where everything that's coming out right now, where it originated from. And there have been people making this path hopefully easier to find and clearing out debris for people to make it a little bit easier to walk this path, and especially now on our planet when we most need it. So thank you. Thank you, Sandy, for the good work you're doing.
So if you want more information about Star Wolf, you can look at her books, podcasts, videos, events, and courses, and the trips that she leads as well at the website shamanicbreathwork.org. That's it for this week. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again, Star Wolf.